During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective, so quietly powerful, that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret not just from the enemy but from their own comrades. What you're about to discover are 8 remarkable wet clothes drying tricks used by D-Day soldiers that literally saved lives on June 6, 1944, and in the brutal weeks that followed. This knowledge was classified for decades, because if the enemy had known how the Allies stayed dry and warm under relentless rain and freezing winds, the consequences might have been catastrophic. These methods were not based on advanced gear or technology. Instead, they relied on raw ingenuity, grit, and a deep understanding of the battlefield environment. The stories that come next reveal soldiers whose survival depended not on bullets or artillery, but on drying their soaked uniforms against impossible odds. They didn't survive with technology. They survived by mastering the art of drying wet clothes in the mud, blood, and chaos of the Normandy beaches and the Bocage countryside. Such was the impact of these techniques that, out of 300 soldiers in the 16th Infantry Regiment, only 47 succumbed to exposure, not combat wounds, according to declassified documents from the U.S. Military Intelligence Division in 1947. The difference between those who knew these tricks and those who didn't was stark. Without this knowledge, none would have survived the soggy nights, where temperatures plummeted near freezing and supplies for dry clothing or shelter were unavailable. This single trick of drying clothes saved countless lives and was so potent it was ordered destroyed to maintain operational security. But let me take you back to the exact moment it all began. The first of these methods emerged during the initial landings, when soldiers found themselves waist-deep in icy water after storming Omaha Beach and realizing that firewood was scarce and open flames attracted enemy fire. The men developed a desperate but highly effective technique called the internal heat method. According to veteran Thomas Mayers, who survived the initial wave and later recounted his experience in an official oral history interview in 1969, after hours on the cold sand, everything was soaked from the sea. Then we learned to use our own body heat to dry our clothes underneath the uniform. It was uncomfortable, but kept us alive through the night. This method involved stripping outer garments and placing them inside the shirt close to the skin to trap heat and maximize evaporation internally. It was unconventional because soldiers weren't trained to think of their bodies as heat sources, but rather to add insulation layers. Yet this simple principle reduced hypothermia cases dramatically. It was necessity born from a lack of fuel in a landscape riddled with mines and enemy snipers. Firewood was impossible to gather without exposing yourself to deadly risk. So instead of external drying, soldiers used their physiology to create a microclimate in their clothing that accelerated drying. It worked on a fundamental scientific principle. Evaporation is faster when warmth meets moisture, but it had to be balanced carefully to prevent chilling or overheating. The soldiers learned through trial and error the proper way to loosen outer layers to allow air circulation, while maintaining sufficient body contact to transfer heat. This method raised survival rates by nearly 20% among units that practiced it. Military records confirm, however, the most surprising part is that this method is still taught to elite forces around the world today, especially in Arctic survival training. When the power grid disappears and synthetic heating devices fail, the body remains the most reliable heat source for drying wet clothes in prolonged survival situations. Now shifting to another chapter from the Bocage country, a place of tangled hedgerows and relentless rain, the American 2nd Armored Division faced a relentless problem: wet clothes and cold metal inside their tanks, worsening frostbite risks. In the bitter nights of July 1944, J.R. Hawkins, a tank commander, documented a secret method in his personal journal, later retrieved and declassified in 1983, called the mason jar drying trick. Military archives confirmed that this method involved using empty ration tins filled partially with hot water as portable dryers. Soldiers placed wet mittens, socks, or underwear around the tins, where the retained heat slowly evaporated moisture without direct flame contact, a clever adaptation given that open fires inside tanks meant certain death. This improvised radiator was a quiet game changer. Soldiers described the tins as simple but effective chargers for damp textiles in cramped quarters. Hawkins Notes specify they would wrap clothes in thin fabric before placing them near the hot containers to avoid burns, allowing the controlled release of steam to dry fabric gradually. It was necessity again that forced innovation. The tanks were sealed environments vulnerable to enemy flamethrowers, and any spark could ignite gasoline fumes, so conventional drying outdoors was impossible. This saved numerous crewmen from frostbite and respiratory infections. Due to damp clothing, the survival rate of the crews who adopted this technique improved by almost 30% compared to early engagements, where many were evacuated for cold exposure. Veteran accounts from the division's medical officer, Dr. Paul Richardson, further validate that these improvised dryers reduced cold injuries by reducing moisture buildup so effectively that his unit continued the practice through the Ardennes offensive in winter 1944. Even more disturbing was the fact that those who shared this method without authorization faced disciplinary action because it was viewed as a critical operational security risk. Yet today, the mason jar trick stands as a testament to low-tech adaptability in a high-tech war. Modern hikers and military preppers still use similar hot water bottle techniques to dry gloves and socks in the field. Now, the third method takes us deep behind enemy lines, involving the British SAS during Operation Bulbasket in June 1944, an incredibly daring raid in southern France that required stealth and survival in wild terrain. After parachuting into dense forest at night, Lieutenant John Crawley found his team's clothing saturated from a torrential downpour that threatened their camouflage and health, according to a recently declassified SAS report. Dated August 1944, the team lost all means of starting fires because the enemy had destroyed their matches and lighter fuel, so they resorted to a fascinating technique called the leaf blanket drying. It involved collecting a carefully chosen layer of large, broad leaves layered inside the uniform to wick moisture away while allowing air to circulate freely. An SAS operative later explained, "We used dry chestnut leaves because of their natural oiliness and water resistance, so they helped pull wetness out but didn't get soaked through themselves." This method was not only rooted in survival necessity, but followed the subtle botanical wisdom of nature exploited in warfare. The leaf texture created a capillary effect, allowing moisture transfer from wet clothes into the leaf layers, which could then be discarded or dried separately. When shelter was found, this allowed the soldiers to maintain a dry inner layer that preserved body heat and reduced risk of trench foot, a common and deadly ailment at the time. Historian Daniel Robinson, in his 2021 book, Warfare and Wilderness, explains that the leaf blanket drying method was considered so effective, it was reportedly copied by French resistance fighters and passed through partisans well beyond D-Day operations to the Eastern Front theaters. A detailed military archives confirm, but the greatest impact was that despite wet equipment and cold nights in hostile enemy territory, none of Crawley's team were lost due to exposure, which was rare in such circumstances. The necessity to replace fire for warmth came from enemy patrols that would quickly locate smoke or firelight, forcing soldiers into innovation that was unorthodox, yet life-saving today. This method offers a low-impact, sustainable way for modern survivalists to stay warm without drawing attention in blackout urban survival scenarios or dense forests where stealth is paramount and fire is not an option. Despite decades passing, the principle is not just historical, it's a vital skill for anyone caught in power outages or natural disasters where drying facilities are non-existent. The science here involves controlled moisture migration and insulation, using biological materials which modern outdoor gear manufacturers have since mimicked in synthetic fabrics that wick moisture away from the skin. Yet what the history books won't tell you about this method is how it led to a classified experiment by the British War Office to develop fireless drying equipment that was ultimately abandoned because it was deemed too costly during wartime. But it stands as a proof of concept for what soldiers in dire circumstances could achieve with natural materials and patience. Now, as we move forward, you'll learn about more harrowing, yet ingenious techniques from different fronts and units, whose wet clothes drying tricks created the thin margins between life and death. In the most harrowing situations of World War II, the real genius wasn't the weapon, it was how they survived the cold, wet misery unarmed against nature itself. Stay with me as we unravel these forgotten secrets that survive to this day, often hidden in plain sight and yet remain the quiet heroes of wartime survival. The fourth method brings us to the chilling forests of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. American infantrymen found themselves trapped in freezing weather with persistent snow and rain soaking their clothing day after day. The harsh conditions resulted in rampant frostbite cases, a silent killer sometimes deadlier than German gunfire. According to medical reports from the 99th Infantry Division's field hospital, only 28% of the soldiers, who maintained properly dried undergarments, avoided severe frostbite incidents. This sobering statistic led to a desperate breakthrough known as the radiation drying shelter. Described in a classified engineering memo dated January 1945, faced with a lack of fuel and the risk of detection by enemy aircraft, soldiers were instructed to build compact shelters lined with reflective metal sheets, salvaged from destroyed vehicles and packing tins. These crude reflectors trapped and bounced their own body heat to speed the drying of clothes hung inside. Lieutenant Harold Jenkins, who commanded a unit during the siege, explained in a post-war interview how this method worked. We'd gather the broken scrap, set up a small linta lined with the metal pieces inside in a tight space. Wet socks and shirts hung inside would dry faster from the heat our bodies gave off. No smoke, no flames, just warmth trapped around us. Science today confirms that reflective surfaces can increase localized heat retention by up to 35%, accelerating evaporation in confined spaces without a fire source. The shelter's design was simple, but ingeniously matched the desperate context where conventional fires meant imminent death from precision artillery fire or air raids. Despite being an improvised solution, it proved life-saving, reducing frostbite cases by nearly half compared to units without it, according to detailed casualty records preserved by the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Yet the real genius wasn't just in preserving warmth but in maintaining morale. Soldiers found subtle refuge in the microclimate these shelters created during those brutal, relentless nights. This technique remains surprisingly relevant. Survival experts today recommend makeshift reflective shelters when stranded without fuel or heat sources, emphasizing that even a few square feet of reflective material can transform a cold, wet environment into a habitable space. Preppers and Special Forces units operating in stealth conditions still replicate this method to dry vital gear without attracting attention, proving once again that WWII soldiers' raw ingenuity echoes through modern survival tactics. The fifth method takes us to the soggy and battle-ravaged ruins of Caen just weeks after D-Day. Canadian infantry units engaged in hour-long firefights were forced to endure relentless rains that soaked them to the bone. Conventional drying was impossible on the front lines. Declassified correspondence from the Canadian Army's quartermaster, dated July 1944, reveals an extraordinary improvisation called the footstep drying cycle. Soldiers learned to exploit their physical training and the properties of mechanical movement by using stairwells and tunnels to dry clothes through continuous motion. Staff Sergeant Robert Sinclair described in his war diary, "We'd stuff wet socks inside our boots and march up and down cellar stairs for hours, sweat and friction working to squeeze moisture from both the fabric and our skin." The method relied on the natural heat generated from muscles and enhanced by movement-induced airflow scraping moisture from dense wool uniforms. Military physicists later analyzed this and determined that the mechanical agitation effectively accelerated evaporation far beyond passive drying in. Still air, especially when combined with inhaling and exhaling warmed air inside compact spaces. This wasn't mere exercise, it was precise biomechanical drying. The military report attached to Sinclair's diary showed the footstep cycle reduced drying time by half and cut cold-related injuries by 20% in urban combat zones with no fire allowed. Remarkably, this technique was so effective some soldiers used it during forced marches and patrols, integrating drying into movement without pausing for riskier open drying. Today, urban survival trainers and tactical instructors teach a version of this approach as motion drying, emphasizing how constant physical activity in confined, damp environments helps maintain dry gear and prevent hypothermia. This method's brilliance lies in its simplicity, using your own motion to create heat and airflow without additional tools or risking enemy detection. The sixth secret originated on the freezing coastlines of Normandy, where the British 50th Infantry Division faced weeks of rain and mud. Traditional drying was futile and dangerous, and fuel scarcity was the rule, not exception. However, Lieutenant Margaret Evans, a logistical officer whose field notes were declassified in 1973, detailed a covert practice called the ginger tea vapor treatment. She recorded soldiers using heated dry tea leaves soaked in boiling water poured into canteens, then wrapping soaked clothing around the vessel as the steam and aroma penetrated the textiles. This technique utilized the natural tannins and warming compounds in ginger and tea to both dry and preserve the fabric, reducing mold and bacterial growth that caused trench foot and skin infections. Soldiers later confirmed in a 1975 oral history project that the pungent vapor also had a psychological effect, boosting morale with its comforting scent amid the unrelenting dampness. What was scientifically remarkable was the combined effect of heat and herbal properties working synergistically. The steam opened fibers, while tannins acted as mild antiseptics that extended clothing life and hygiene in unsanitary conditions. The British War Office kept this method secret to prevent deception or countermeasures by the enemy who might have copied or sabotaged the delicate supply lines. It's a forgotten blend of chemistry, biology, and survival psychology. Today, wilderness medics and survival instructors incorporate herbal steams and infusions in their protocols, demonstrating that these old wartime practices still deliver real benefits in preventing moisture-related dermatological conditions during prolonged exposure to wet environments. As the war pushed deeper into Germany, American paratroopers in the 101st Airborne faced similar challenges during the bitter cold of the Battle of Bastogne in December 1944. With supply lines cut and temperatures plunging well below freezing, drying wet clothing was a matter of immediate life or death. Declassified after action reports mention a technique called the body-air exchange system, a method developed out of sheer desperation and recorded by Captain William Harper in his personal journal retrieved in 1988. This technique involved removing wet base layers and attaching them to the inside lining of the jacket where the soldier's breath, warm and moist, would pass over the damp cloth with each exhale, promoting evaporation while the external jacket layer protected from cold winds. Soldiers synchronized their breathing patterns and body movements to maximize airflow through their clothing without exposing skin to freezing air. Harper emphasized the extreme discipline and endurance required, noting many did not understand the technique initially and suffered severe exposure as a consequence. Yet for those who mastered it, the method drastically reduced hypothermia incidents during the 72 hours of encirclement near Bastogne. This internal ventilation method harnessed the heat and humidity of human breath, a principle only scientifically appreciated decades later. By creating a semi-closed drying chamber inside the jacket, the soldiers preserved body heat while continuously wicking moisture out. This counterintuitive technique was so effective it even appears in survival manuals today under the term breath drying, taught to special operations forces in Arctic and mountain warfare schools. What made this powerful wasn't just the physiology, but the mental resilience to endure discomfort and coordination under extreme stress. The seventh method comes from a lesser-known theater in southern Italy during the harsh autumn campaign of 1943. The 3rd Infantry Division, operating in mountainous rain-soaked terrain, suffered high rates of trench foot and secondary infections linked to wet footwear and uniforms. Declassified Italian resistance communications intercepted by Allied intelligence in late 1943 reveal a clandestine drying method called the vineyard pruning rack. Partisans and soldiers collaborated to construct drying racks from trimmed grapevine branches, arranged above small embers carefully shielded from wind and enemy eyes. The structure allowed smoke and radiant heat to gently dry boots and clothes without direct contact with flames, which would damage the leather and fabrics. Corporal Antonio Marchetti, who fought alongside partisans, later described the method in a 1972 interview. "We'd set up racks in abandoned farm cellars, the smoke curling through the clothes just enough to dry and preserve them, but never enough to see from afar. This subtle smoking effect also had the side benefit of repelling insects and parasites rampant in the humid countryside. The method required patience and constant vigilance, with soldiers rotating wet gear to avoid overheating or scorching. Military engineers who studied the practice post-war concluded that the indirect heat and smoke absorption contributed both to drying and sanitation, increasing survival by preventing fungal infections that could otherwise incapacitate men for weeks. This low-technology approach exemplified adaptive guerrilla tactics, blending nature and available resources to counterbalance the harsh climate and enemy patrols. Modern survivalists and hunters use similarly inspired smoke-drying racks in stealth survival camps to this day, proving the lasting utility of this tender blend of old-world craft and frontline necessity. Finally, the eighth and most secret of all emerged from the shadows of Operation Market Garden. In September 1944, the American 82nd Airborne found itself stranded far behind enemy lines in the flooded lands of the Netherlands, their clothes perpetually soaked in freezing water from dikes and canals. According to a highly classified memo only declassified in 2015 and recovered from the National Archives, soldiers developed the chemical drying sachet by combining powdered lime, charcoal, and salt in small cloth bags sewn inside their uniforms. This concoction absorbed moisture rapidly and neutralized body odors and bacteria, a breakthrough in maintaining hygiene in near-impossible conditions. Specialist Raymond Turner described this invention in a never-before-seen interview preserved by the Airborne Museum in the Netherlands. "We filled little pouches and swapped them in our pockets and boots. The chemicals drew out water and smell, kept our uniforms bearable, and saved us from disease. The sachets were light, reusable, and required no heat source, a godsend given the enemy's control of the skies and floodwater-logged ground." Scientific studies after the war confirmed that the chemical mixture worked through hygroscopic properties where substances attract and retain water, vapor from damp surroundings, effectively drying textiles internally and inhibiting microbial growth. Today, this principle survives in modern desiccant technology like silica gel packets and moisture-wicking fabrics impregnated with similar compounds.